Good afternoon. This is the Blackman's Read Aloud Hour coming to you around 2 o'clock on this Monday, the 19th of February, President's Day. What does President's Day mean to this black man? Of course, we've read or should have read what does the 4th of July mean to The Slave by Frederick Douglass. Well, today I wanted to do a personal reflection on the importance or lack of importance of why black people should not look at President's Day as anything special. Of course, the date, which celebrates supposedly all the men who occupied the office of the President of the United States, is celebrated today. In reality, the day focuses on two men in the history of this nation who achieved the rank of president. The first being the first president of the United States, George Washington, and the other being Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States. Of all the men who served the presidency, I think 45 administrations, some serving single terms, some serving dual terms, and one actually serving or being elected to 4 terms, but only serving 3. This office has really not been a friend to black Americans. One man was called the so-called father of our nation. The other man was so-called the liberator of our enslaved ancestors. One man would lead a nation's army in the infancy of its development into battle against the mightiest empire in the world at the time, England. The Crown and the British Empire. The other man led a split nation's army in a battle against itself to ensure that the federal government maintained its rights to control the decisions of humanity in a nation at more war with itself against the bitterness and cruelty of enslavement. As Frederick Douglass says so eloquently, Abraham Lincoln was not the president for the black man. He was indeed the president for the white man, as was George Washington. Both men actually held office at a time when the majority of blacks in America were considered nothing more than chattel, property, just as livestock, animals, nothing more, nothing less, that could be brought and sold at the whim of their owners. Owners that, in order to control these human beings, used all measures of psychological and physiological tactics and terror and mayhem to control them. George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. When I was in elementary school and first introduced to George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, there was nothing bad to be said about these two men. I remember the story that George Washington couldn't tell a lie, and Abraham Lincoln was a savior. I was brainwashed to love the essence of each man's greatness without ever actually being fed the truth about each man's inequities or shortcomings. If George Washington was the so-called father of the nation, who was this nation's mother? If George Washington birthed the nation, birthing the nation was an act of appropriation, was that an illicit affair? Did racism, bigotry, and prejudice embody the features of our country's mother as well? Why did the actions led by George Washington and his band of revolutionaries that created this nation so readily accept human bondage as a normal circumstance in this country's formation. As you look back at the first 16 presidents, only three of the first 16 presidents didn't own slaves: John Adams, John Quincy Adams, and Abraham Lincoln. As a child growing up, I wasn't given access to the true nature of George Washington. I was only allowed in the history books or in the readers at the time to glimpse into the mythology of George Washington, the man whom as a boy couldn't tell a lie when confronted by his father about the chopped down cherry tree. When growing up as a child, I always rode on Route 3 in Westmoreland County, Virginia, to visit my father's mother and my father's relatives. In those trips down Route 3, I passed the boyhood home of George Washington in Westmoreland County, Virginia. I'd wonder about those lessons taught in school. Where on this plantation was exactly that cherry tree? And did the hatchet that did the deed still exist? The real questions I should have been asking my young mind and the minds of those who passed this wasted bit of knowledge on me was, how and why did this man of supposed honor, even at a young age, accept the enslavement and brutalization of another man and woman simply because that man and woman's skin color? George Washington led his charges into battle against the British Empire for a nation's independence, but he only wanted a white man's independence from the wrath of King George of England. Yet George Washington and his ilk knew that the tide was turning in the British Empire against slavery, which was abolished in 1772. Those in Washington's legions of liberators knew if the British were successful in the battle against the American patrols of liberty, or the patriots of liberty, it wouldn't be long before the British Empire would follow suit in America and close the doors on slavery. There was no way in hell that the Southern plantation owners would give in or give up their most valued resources of freed and enslaved labor. So into the battle of freedom, George Washington went, fully understanding that his battle for liberty was a celebratory event to the glory of George Washington by white Americans. But by black Americans, well, not so much. George Washington was not and never intended to be the father of a true democratic America. George Washington and his liberty minions only saw freedom for white men, who in turn could continue to enlist savagery on those shackled for their own sick pleasures of both economic and physical gain. I mean, come on now. One of George Washington's Virginia buddies, James Madison, actually abused sexually his slave and forced that woman, that slave, to give birth to a child who James Madison sold into slavery. James Madison being the 5th president of the United States. So, okay, if not George Washington, surely Abraham Lincoln, the man I was taught. As a matter of fact, the first visit I took to Washington, D.C. in elementary school was to visit the Lincoln Memorial and also the Ford Theater as a 6th grader at Fort Worthington Elementary School in East Baltimore. I was told and taught that George Washington, had it not been for Abraham Lincoln, we would still be slaves. Lincoln was not born of wealth and privilege like George Washington. The myth, the man, was born in a log cabin in the mountains of Kentucky. Abraham Lincoln was a log splitter, a self-taught man, like the former president Andrew Jackson. He was considered to be the president of all mankind. The president I was taught was going to be the great emancipator, If you've ever visited the Emancipation statue in Washington, D.C., you'll see George Washington standing tall as an enslaved man in chains, is looking up to the great emancipator as if he was God. As a child, I was taught that he believed that all men, whether creed, content, or character, were equal. Well, history books have proven that to be not so true. As a child growing up, as I said, in Maryland, the significance of Abraham Lincoln was astounding. Everything I learned about Abraham Lincoln in elementary school and actually in junior high school was the mythology of Abraham Lincoln. Actually, John Wilkes Booth was, so to speak, you would say the Judas of Black Americans, because he killed Abraham Lincoln, or assassinated Abraham Lincoln in Ford's Theater. We've all read the words of the Emancipation Proclamation, or we should have, the words of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is housed at the National Archives. And with great pride, I went to visit the National Archive and saw that document. I also learned about Frederick Douglass, who I was told loved Lincoln and believed that Lincoln was indeed the great emancipator as well. Of course, Frederick Douglass's speech in 1876 put that asunder when he told those in the audience, Supreme Court justices, the President Ulysses S. Grant, the Vice President, and other government leaders, that Abraham Lincoln was never the president for Black Americans. He was the president for white Americans. Lincoln had some of the feelings of inadequacy that he felt about Black Americans being equal to white Americans. He did indeed lead a beleaguered nation, Union armies, into battle against the Confederates in some of the most savage confrontations this nation has ever experienced. Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, the battles of Bull Run, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, Cold Harbor, the Battle of Petersburg, and finally the Battle of Richmond, which led to the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. All of these battles were in defense of a nation that was fathered by George Washington. However, had George Washington still survived, would he have fought for the side of the Confederacy, defending those who sought to continue the enslavement of people of color? I'm quite sure that he would have. I'm sure that Francis Scott Key, the writer or the author of the Star-Spangled Banner, his intentions were that he would have fought for the savior or the salvation of the Confederate States. In my adult years, I've learned much about Lincoln's ambivalent feelings towards people of color. Lincoln, in every fiber of his body, never for once believed that Black men or women were the equal of their white brothers and sisters. Yet he was forced to see that the defeat of the Southern armies was dependent on his freeing our enslaved ancestors. So he gave in finally to allow Black soldiers to fight for their freedom and to end this conflict and maintain dignity. He surely would have sacrificed the freedom of the peoples of color had this Confederacy accepted the right to keep the slaves but not expand slavery. Lincoln was forced to play a hand he never intended to play, but circumstances beyond his control forced his actions. The stringent racists in the old order of Southern aristocracy felt that it was necessary to be allowed to expand slavery beyond the states that slavery was in, and even across the borders of other countries, because the advantage of free labor to spread beyond the nation's plans for westward expansion ensured that these Southern aristocrats could continue to bleed the black man and feed their wealth. This was not going to occur, so it was so cornered, just like the perceived ideals that the British Empire promoted 90 years earlier, that they struck against the tyrants threatening their economic well-being. Lincoln would have maintained the institution of slavery, but he couldn't do that and save the Union, because he also knew that the Southern aristocrats, or the aristocracy, the Southern aristocracy, would never agree to the controlled expansion of slavery. So once the decision was made in the South to start the Civil War and lay waste to Fort Sumter, the tide had been set, the die had been cast, and the war would be started. But even after the military action, even after all of those awful battles, Lincoln still in 1865 went to Alexander Stephens and offered him a great belief of peace, saying that the nation would pay reparations to the Southern slaveholders if they would end this awful war. But the Southern aristocracy said, no, we must keep our slaves. And we would never accept a peace without slavery. And that's when Lincoln decided that emancipation was the only recourse for this nation. Even as late as 1865, Abraham Lincoln was willing to end the war and pay reparations to slaveholders. So I say on this day, on this President's Day, what does the President Day mean to me as a Black American? Edwin Starr sang in his song War in 1970 the line, "What does war mean? Absolutely nothing. Say it again." What does President's Day mean to me in 2024? Absolutely nothing. Say it again. What about the other presidents? Why not celebrate them? Well, according to my history, no president besides the President Obama, who resided in the White House for 8 years, has exactly been a friend to Black Americans. And it can be said that President Obama, in the final analysis, wasn't totally our friend. Of course, we were able to have big parties at the White House and soul music and Aretha Franklin and having Beyonce and Jay-Z at the White House was really good, really a really good thing. But in actuality, what did it really mean to the Black communities for those 8 years that President Obama ran the White House? As a matter of fact, President Obama said, he wasn't a president for Black Americans, he was a president for all Americans, which he meant white Americans. I mean, if you look at the presidents from 1 to 16, as I said, only 3 of those presidents didn't own slaves. And then if you look at the presidents from 16 to 45, many of those presidents supported the persecution of Black people in America. How many of those presidents actually went to bat and went to war for Black Americans to end lynching? Lynching continued in this country, a lynching of our ancestors. There have been 45 presidents. And although President Obama was handcuffed and vilified by the legislative branch of the federal government to ensure he would never provide any sanctuary or reparations to the majority of Black Americans in his nation. He could have took a stand and said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make it right. He didn't make it right. Joe Biden hasn't made it right. Donald Trump didn't make it right. John F. Kennedy didn't make it right. Lyndon Baines Johnson didn't make it right. Ronald Reagan actually started his presidential campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi. He didn't make it right. Richard Nixon didn't make it right. George Bush Sr., George Bush Jr. didn't make it right. President Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower, led the great armies in World War II, became the president, and then appointed Earl Warren to the Supreme Court as Chief Justice, and said that was his worst decision that he ever made, because Earl Warren's court produced the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. And of course, Eisenhower said that he understood the Southern animosity against that, because those Southerners didn't want their white daughters to go to school with black brutes. Eisenhower didn't make it right. Harry Truman didn't make it right. FDR didn't make it right. Herbert Hoover didn't make it right. Woodrow Wilson reinstituted segregation in the federal government. Didn't make it right. Rutherford B. Hayes didn't make it right. Ulysses S. Grant could have made it right, but he was too busy making sure that his cronies lined their pockets rather than supporting any type of reparations for Black Americans. So as my brothers and sisters go out today and celebrate President's Day with the sales at all the stores, I'll just look around and say, which president is going to make it right? Because we haven't had one yet to do it. Have a great day, and thank you.